Give me 1 second. All right. Good evening, everybody. I hope you're able to see the screen. And I'm so thankful to God for giving me this opportunity to come in His presence and to be able to be with everyone today evening, and to be able to share God's word with all of us today evening. And I want to thank the elders of the assembly for giving me this opportunity too. And before we get started, let's just bow our heads again one more time. Father God, we thank you for this time that you have given us to come into your presence. We thank you for allowing me, Lord, to be able to read your word, Lord, and understand it. And today, as I speak, Lord, I pray that only the words that you want me to speak be able to come out of my mouth, and that today we'll be edified and encouraged by this word, Lord. And in your name we pray, amen. And so tonight we're going to be talking about an interesting subject. It'll be the vengeance of God, something that we don't really talk about often. And I know when we usually turn to passages, people will say, let's turn to a familiar passage. Well, tonight I will be asking you to turn to somewhat unfamiliar, uncommon passage for us. It's in the book of Numbers. It's going to be Numbers chapter 31. And as you turn to it, I want us to remember that we're looking at, even though we're looking at this from the 21st century, and from our point of view, we need to remember to envision the time period and the cultural context before exacting how we feel about God's vengeance in the story. And so Numbers 31 is where we are headed tonight, and we'll be reading the first 18 verses today. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, take vengeance on the Midianites for the children of Israel. Afterward, you shall be gathered to your people. So Moses spoke to the people, saying, arm some of yourselves for war, and let them go against the Midianites to take vengeance for the Lord on Midian. 1,000 from each tribe of all the tribes of Israel you shall send to the war. So there were recruited from the divisions of Israel 1,000 from each tribe, 12,000 armed for war. Then Moses sent them to the war, 1,000 from each tribe. He sent them to the war with Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the priest, with the holy articles and the signal trumpets in his hand. And they warred against the Midianites, just as the Lord commanded Moses, and they killed all the males. They killed the kings of Midian with the rest of those who were killed: Levi, Rechem, Zur, Hur, and Reba, the 5 kings of Midian. Balaam, the son of Beor, they also killed with the sword. And the children of Israel took the women of Midian captive with their little ones, and took as spoil all their cattle, all their flocks, and all their goods. They also burned with fire all the cities where they dwelt, and all their forts. And they took all the spoil and all the booty of man and beast. Then they brought the captives, the booty, and the spoil to Moses, to Eleazar the priest, and to the congregation of the children of Israel, to the camp in the plains of Moab by the Jordan, across from Jericho. And Moses, Eleazar the priest, and all the leaders of the congregation went to meet them outside the camp. But Moses was angry with the officers of the army, with the captains over thousands and captains over hundreds, who had come from the battle. And Moses said to them, have you kept all the women alive? Look, these women caused the children of Israel through the counsel of Balaam to trespass against the Lord in the incident of Peor. And there was a plague among the congregation of the Lord. Now therefore kill every male among the little ones, and kill every woman who has known a man intimately. But keep alive for yourselves all the young girls who have not known a man intimately. And so this is the portion that we'll be looking at tonight, something that maybe you have read before, maybe you've read during family prayer or in your own personal time, but it's not something I haven't heard in a while us speaking about. And interestingly enough, this came out of a discussion, looking at this passage even in the first place, came out of a discussion that I was having with a friend over how can we worship a God who, in this passage, as we see here, he has allowed these little children and these men and women to all die a very horrible death. But before that, let's take a step back. Who were the Midianites? The first reference we have in the Bible of the Midianites is in Genesis 25, verse 2. And there we are reading about what happens right after Sarah's death, and in how Abraham takes another wife named Keturah, And in verse 2, it reads, and she bore him Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. So Midian is originally one of the sons of Abraham, but through Keturah. And his family expanded, and this people group, this nomadic group, settled on both sides of the Gulf of Aqaba, which is right next to modern-day Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Israel, very close in proximity in the Canaan region. And so in relation to Israel as a nation itself, we see a few more times in the Bible, in the Old Testament itself, where Midian and Israel is mentioned in conjunction or with Moses. The first of that is in Exodus 2:15, where Moses flees to Midian and meets his wife there. And Jethro, his father-in-law, is a priest who also has the knowledge of God. So that's a key thing too. At that time, the Midianites were aligned with God. That's the evidence we have, at least from what we can tell with how Jethro's relationship with God was. Numbers 10:29, another Midianite, Hobab, Moses' brother-in-law, is a guide to Israelites. And then Numbers 22 verse 4 is sort of where we start to see the relationship between Israel and Midian start to sour. And we can go over there to Numbers 24, because Numbers 22 verse 4, because that kind of sets the stage for everything that happens in the next about 10 chapters. Numbers 22, we can start actually from verse 1 up to 4. We'll set that stage up. Then the children of Israel moved and camped in the plains of Moab on the side of Jordan across from Jericho. Now Balak the son of Zippor saw all that Israel had done to the Amorites, and Moab was exceedingly afraid of the people, because they were many, and Moab was sick with dread because of the children of Israel. So verse 4, so Moab said to the elders of Midian, now this company will lick up everything around us, as an ox licks up the grass of the field. And Balak the son of Zippor was the king of the Moabites at the time. And so here we see this is what ends up happening after the Israelites are wandering and coming out of Egypt. They are now beginning to be perceived as a threat by many of the nomadic neighbors in the region. And we know this because for nomadic groups, it's very important for them to be in areas where there's good natural resources for their flocks and for their families too. So we can see how they may have perceived Israel to be like the ox that licks up the grass of the field, and therefore saw them as a very dangerous threat. And not only that, but even for religious reasons to with them and their idol worship versus a monotheistic God that Israel is following. Now, Numbers 25 verse 6 is the next time we see something specific coming out from God to Midian. Numbers 25 verse 14 to 18 shows us, verse 17 specifically, God says, harass the Midianites and attack them, for they harassed you with their schemes by which they seduced you in the matter of Peor, and in the matter of Cosbi, the daughter or of a leader of Midian, their sister, who was killed in the day of the plague because of Peor. So let's wind back a minute. So after it tells us that the Midianites the Moabites perceived Israel to be a threat. But we see there that Balak, the son of Zippor, is in charge. He's the king of the Moabites. As we all know, he calls Balaam to come to his place and to look at from 3 different hills, 3 different areas, and to try and curse the children of Israel. But each time he does that, God does not allow that to happen, but rather God blesses the children of Israel. And there's even some future prophecies that are told in each of those oracles that Balaam is proclaiming. However, so in not being able to, Balaam was unsuccessful in cursing Israel like Balak would have wanted him to. However, in Numbers 31:16, we read that Balaam actually suggested to Balak a different way to trap the Israelites and to stop them from becoming an exceeding threat to them. And how that happens is Balaam suggests to Balak that the Moabites and the Midianites convene a religious feast to honor Baal, and that they invite the Jews to attend. We have evidence of this if we turn to Numbers 25 verse 1. Now Israel remained in Acacia Grove, and the people began to commit harlotry with the women of Moab. They invited the people to the sacrifice of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. So Israel was joined to Baal of Peor, and the anger of the Lord was aroused against Israel. As I said, the feast was something out of neighborly friendship. The Midianites and the Moabites had invited them over, And the feast would involve idolatry and abominable immorality and would be a flagrant violation of Israel's covenant with the Lord. What Balaam couldn't do in appealing to demons and in his 3 times of trying to curse the Israelites, he was able to accomplish by appealing to the flesh and inviting the Jews to enjoy themselves at Baal Peor. Now, this is also significant for another reason too. Numbers 25 verse 3 is the first recorded occasion of Israel's relationship with Baal. Many times across from this point on, we will read in the Chronicles, in First Samuel, and in the Kings and many other Old Testament books of Baal, repeatedly the children of Israel going to Baal. And there is a specific reason for why this is. Baal was the chief of the Canaanite gods and was especially responsible for rain and fertility. And up until the Israelites were sent to Babylon, they continued to be an agricultural society, and much of their society and their economy was built up on agriculture, along with the shepherding that they did. But a major component of all of this, their society was built on agriculture. So whenever there was a drought, they would turn to Baal instead of God. And so this becomes a significant snare for the children of Israel in the coming years. And another practice is there were many other wrong practices also involved in this Baal worship, involving male and female harlots and sexual immorality, which makes it very clear to us that in verse 25, in chapter 25, the Israelites stepped out of bounds. They had crossed the line, and they had done things which were forbidden in God's law. Now, as a result, the anger of the Lord was aroused against Israel, and he sends a plague that kills almost 24,000 people. And this plague is so significant that not only do we see this in verse 9, number 25, verse 9, where it says, and those who died in the plague were 24,000. We actually get a second reminder about this in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 3-4. Your eyes have seen what the Lord did at Baal Peor, for the Lord your God has destroyed from among you all the men who followed Baal of Peor. But you who held fast to the Lord your God are alive today, every one of you. And so this is a side point here, a point of application for us too, that even among this group of Israelites who were led away by Baal Peor, there was still a group that stood strong in the Lord and was faithful to him. This is a recurring theme that we continue to see of a remnant in Israel, a remnant group, and that is something that reminds us to continue in our faithfulness to him in spite of whatever else is going on in the world and how people around us are reacting, to continue to be faithful to God in everything that we do and with our lives. Now let's continue. So we see that the Lord sends a plague that kills almost 24,000 people. And this is actually only stopped when Phinehas, the grandson of Aaron, takes a javelin and throws it at one of the Israelites who's caught in the act of sinning. And so God actually does not punish him, because he said in verse 11, Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, has turned back my wrath from the children of Israel, because he was zealous with my zeal among them, so that I did not consume the children of Israel in my zeal. Behold, I give to him my covenant of peace. So actually God saw it there as he was doing that action on behalf of God. And out of that, God says that he will stop the plague from occurring. And so the plague ends, and God promises to get his vengeance back on the people of Midian for what they have done. So let's pause here and look. So out of sinning here, God has already immediately provided repercussions to those who have sinned on the Israelite side. And yet those who helped them to commit the sin, the Midianites, we're about to see the repercussions for them as well. In verse 17, as I just mentioned earlier, God speaks to Moses saying, harass the Midianites and attack them. And so that's what we're seeing in Numbers 31. And of course, if we hadn't looked at all this background context, this would have been a very one-sided look at how God treats human beings. And so let's go back to the Numbers 31, back where we were earlier. We see 2 key phrases. One is in verse 2, take vengeance on the Midianites for the children of Israel. And in verse 7, and they warred against the Midianites just as the Lord commanded Moses, and they killed all the males, just as the Lord commanded Moses. So as we see here, the plan and the details for this assault on Midian came directly from God. This continues to be this is the framework for the later war plans and the battles that Israel faces. where they take all their instructions from God and then they follow it out. And also note the presence of God when he has Phineas to take the son of Eleazar, the priest, with the holy articles and the signal trumpets in his hand. So there was also that presence there of God with the holy items as well. So another reason why it is important to note that God had planned this entire assault was because of verse 49. We read in verse 49 that the army officers, they all come to Moses and say, "Your servants have taken account of the men of war who are under our command, and not a man of us is missing." And so we can see here, not only did God plan this entire battle plan clearly and very thoughtfully, but he made sure that not a single person on the side of Israel lost their lives that day. Another interesting point we see here is when we looked at verse in chapter 25 about the children of Israel playing the harlot. I didn't mention this specifically, but if you look there in verse 25, it does mention the woman that was sinning along with the man that Phineas kills. He mentions the name of the man. His name is Zimri. He's one of the Simeonites, and the woman who he was sinning with, her name was Cosbi, the daughter of Zur. Now, Cosbi is killed by the javelin throw, but we also see how God's judgment goes back to take care of Zur, the father of Cosbi. He also is killed in this fight. And it just goes to show how far the repercussions of sin can affect people in real life. And Zur, the father of the woman, is killed fulfilling God's word from chapters earlier, because when he says to harass the Midianites, he also specifically mentions this woman and her family. So we see how the Israelites have successfully killed all the men of war. And here we come to verse 14. They have just returned with a lot of spoil, all the women and the children, which they're taken captive. And Moses comes out to meet them, but he is angry. Moses was angry with the officers of the army, with the captains over thousands and captains over hundreds who had come from the battle. And Moses said to them, "Have you kept all the women alive?" And before we look into this, I kind of see a parallel to 1 Samuel 15, where those of you who know, Samuel is mad at Saul because of him. He didn't choose to destroy completely even the animals and the other possessions of the Amalekites. And this was important to God. We can take a side note here and look at what exactly happened there. Samuel was telling Saul to defeat and utterly destroy the Amalekites. If we look in Deuteronomy 25, we read how the Amalekites, a long time ago, back in this Exodus time, when the Israelites were leaving Egypt, the Amalekites had come and assaulted them and defeated their utterly weak and vulnerable portion. In Deuteronomy 25, it specifies, you can just take a look at that real quick. Deuteronomy 25, verse 17, it says, "Remember what Amalek did to you on the way, how he met you on the way and attacked your rear ranks, all the stragglers at your rear when you were tired and weary, and he did not fear God." So that's an interesting subpoint too. We're seeing here the retribution of God immediately after the children of Israel play harlot with the Midianites. But even for the Amalekites too, after that many years, God's intended plan was to use Saul to provide retribution against that people because they did not fear God and they did an evil thing in his sight. And this also shows us the consistent nature of God in this time of the law. Many will try and reason as to how can God allow this to happen. But if we look at these different occurrences, these different events, we still see a consistent nature of God in exacting retribution and vengeance on behalf of the children of Israel. Now, let's go back to 31, and we're looking at what happens right after Moses is angry. Moses tells them to kill the male children, and he tells to kill all the women who have known a man. Now, as we look at this specific portion, this is where it starts to go into a little bit of gray area, and I'll explain why in a second. But I've also used some Bible scholars' comments on this from commentaries in understanding this tonight. So first off, why did God ask Moses to kill these children? One of the reasons may be because of tribal warfare in that time. As I mentioned earlier, this was a nomadic time, nomadic people groups. And in that time, unlike today, where we're very sophisticated with war treaties, with how we treat prisoners of war, none of those kind of privileges existed back then. It was a very savage type of time. And so there would be possibility of future revenge by the children of the Midianites against Israel. So from that threat standpoint, God may have chosen to wipe out these children, so that they would not rise up later and to take revenge on the children of Israel. Another reason could be because of the heinous and disgusting sins going on at that time. If you turn to Leviticus with me, we're told of some very shocking, very graphic sins. Verse 21 onwards, where it talks about all the different sexual immorality going on at the time and how people are passing through fire. So basically, child sacrifice is also occurring. And the key verse here is in verse 24, Leviticus 18:24. Do not defile yourselves with any of these things, for by all these the nations are defiled, which I am casting out before you. This tells us that all the nations that God is asking the Israelites to wipe out on their way to the promised land, they're getting judged because they are doing these very devious and very immoral sins. And God is asking them not to be like that. And so that actually helps us in our understanding of this situation, knowing that the Midianites were very much involved in these kind of practices. Even though early on Jethro was a follower of God, later down these generations, they were doing these devious acts. And it shows us, so this passage actually shows us the disgusting sins being committed by the Midianites. And so this is where we have to look at this from a different standpoint. Isaiah 55 tells us that God tells us, my thoughts are not your thoughts and my ways are not your ways. So in our discussion of this, we should understand we won't fully understand why God decided to kill the male children. We won't 100% have the logical reasoning as to that. And that's okay, because Bible scholars say in God's perfect knowledge, including his knowledge of what would happen in the lives of these young Midianites, had they lived, it's possible God brought them to himself before they had the opportunity to reject him. It is highly possible that had these males grown to maturity, they would have embraced the wanton rebellion, those very sexually immoral sins, and the idolatry of their fathers following Baal Peor. But from God's perspective, it may have been better for them to die at a young age than to endure a life of depravity and the attending temporal and eternal consequences. And so what can we make of this entire situation? We know for a fact the Bible teaches us that God is goodness and that God is true. And we also know that in God there is no evil and that he is pure. So in God's goodness and in God's righteous judgment, he decided that it would be better for these children to die at the hand of his justice than to pursue the sinful nature of their fathers. And that is something that we as believers have to just understand in faith, because we know that in our human minds, we're limited in that. And yet we can trust that because of his certain attributes, we know that whatever he did in his mind was right. Now, another key point here, which is often overlooked, is about the women who did not know a man intimately. They were told to be, the command from Moses for them was that they were to be kept as, they were to be taken in and to be kept as servants. And as per Moses' instructions, that was allowed because, and interestingly, it was a sign of God's grace in that time. Had these women been freed from their captivity, they would have been left to be attacked by the savage tribes in the area. Remember all the different sins that we have just read in Leviticus 18. That may be on the sexual immorality side, which means then on the violent side too, how much worse, and how evil it would have been too. And so many times we see this happening where God makes provisions for these vulnerable groups to be protected. And so these women are able to travel along with the children of Israel and to be protected in that same manner. Now, what can we tell in looking at this from if we zoom out from what we've just been talking about, what can we understand and what can we tell? So we've been looking basically at how a loving God today, everybody knows God in the world to be, a God that loves everybody and he does not judge, right? And so they are very shocked to hear that a God like this would allow the children of Israel to murder these women and children. A key point there, I use the word murder because many people mistake that and mistakenly describe that here when they look at what's happening. They think it's murder, but actually murder is the premeditated and unlawful taking of a life. However, God clearly commands it out of his vengeance and knowing that Midian had stepped the line. So in a sense, this is a righteous killing that God does. Second, we are not God, and therefore to presuppose God should have done X or Y in this place is wrong on our part, because as we just mentioned, God's ways are not our ways. And so we're not beholden to that. And then now that we know the circumstance of what these young children were living in, a time of child sacrifice and all the immorality going on at the time, it does shift our view dramatically of whether even God could be wrong in doing that. And finally, something that I learned in investigating this entire thing is we don't really have a right to call it good or bad of what God's choice was there, because what God has decided is not humanly understandable and rational. We are not able to fully process that, but we can know that, as I mentioned earlier, because we know God's character to be consistent, that we can trust that whatever decision he has made is good in his eyes. So does this leave us powerless, I should say? Does this leave us far and kind of feel like we're being controlled and that God is far away from us? I think rather that it tells us the opposite. If we look at the way God works in this for the children of Israel, we see a God who cares and who protects, who exacts vengeance on those who enabled them to sin as well. How in every single way, God even went so far as to kill the man who had his daughter sleeping with one of the children of Israel. It shows how far and how wide the repercussions of sinning take someone. And yet it also shows how much God cares, as we look to how not a single person in the Israeli camp died that day when they battled against the children of Midian. And the officers were so shocked that if you read in Numbers 31, verse 51, 52, they received, of all the plunder that they had taken from Midianites, they were so happy and overjoyed at how not a single person died that they actually gave extra as a tribute to God, out of respect for that as well, and honor to God. Second was an interesting point about the act that Phineas did, and Phineas' zeal for God reminds the zeal with which we should be trying to pursue righteousness. In the same way that he had that much zeal to remove the sin in front of everybody, we should have that in our own personal lives to see how proactive are we with identifying where we could fall and trying to remove ourselves from that. And secondly, too, Phineas did that in front of all the children of Israel. They all saw it as he chased after that man, and after he threw the javelin. And so, in a sense, that is a picture of to us too, for us to be an example, right? Everybody else saw how the zeal of God had consumed him, and so he became an example then and there of how God's zeal had consumed him. In a similar way, obviously, we're not taking a javelin and throwing it, but in our own lives too today, we should be able to pursue God with such a zeal that we become an example to others of how close we're trying to follow in God's footsteps and trying to be more like him by reading his word. And I think one of the greatest things I've understood from this study personally too is how consistent God continues to be. What a great thing it is, a great knowledge it is for us to know that the same God who in Numbers 31 does all these things and exacts his revenge and shows his love and care is the same God who provided his son for us in the law as we live in the law of grace, so that today we can come to his presence with a boldness of heart, but also knowing that that character of God remains, that the righteousness of God still remains in how much he cannot tolerate sin. And so at times when we feel that our coming into God's presence is very casual, maybe this can be an encouragement to us about that attribute of God is still there, the righteousness of God and how holy he is. And only because of the work on the cross are we able to stand complete in him. And so this was just a short thought that I had. I'm once again very thankful to the elders and to our church family for allowing me to speak today evening. And with these thoughts, may his name be glorified.